I brought a gift I'd waited 3 years to give him, my father's original blueprint, restored and framed, to our company's 20th anniversary gala. I walked into that ballroom expecting champagne and nostalgia. What I got instead was watching my husband rename my father's company after himself, then drop to one knee in front of 300 people to propose to his own COO. And by the time I made it to the parking garage, I had already started taking it all back. But to understand why I didn't scream, why I didn't throw my glass of champagne at his perfectly pressed tuxedo, you have to go back to the beginning. You have to understand what 20 years of being useful, but never seen, does to a person. My name is Vivian Reyes Calloway. Most people who know me call me V. I'm 44 years old, a structural engineer by training, and for 2 decades I've been the quiet architecture behind a company that everyone assumed belonged to my husband. My father started Reyes Calloway Design Group in a rented storefront on King Street in Charleston, back when the only equipment he owned was a drafting table and a stubborn belief that southern cities deserved buildings that respected their bones instead of bulldozing them. I grew up under that drafting table, literally, doing homework on the floor while he sketched cornices and load-bearing walls late into the night. I met Derek Sinclair in graduate school, Dex, everyone called him. He didn't have my father's patience for structural math, but he had something my father didn't, a gift for walking into a room and making people believe in things before they existed. He could sell a blank lot as a landmark. He could make a boardroom fall in love with a rendering. We made sense together, on paper and off it. I built the things. He sold the things. When my father passed 12 years ago, his shares moved into a family trust, and over time, through funding rounds and buybacks Derek himself helped structure, that trust came to hold 71% of the company. Derek knew this. He'd helped write the paperwork. What he also did, slowly, without ever framing it as a decision, was make sure I never stood in front of a camera. Investors like a single, clear voice, he told me once, early on, when I asked why he was doing all the press for a bridge design that had been entirely mine. You're the strategy behind the curtain, V. That's not smaller, that's smarter. I believed him. For years I believed him, because it felt true, and because I have never needed applause to know my own worth. Or so I told myself. I told myself privacy was a choice. I told myself it didn't matter that magazines called him the visionary founder, while I sat at home reviewing structural load calculations that would keep his visionary buildings from falling down. It was a small unfairness at first, the kind you can absorb without noticing the shape it's carving into you. When our firm won the Charleston Design Award for the Harbor Pavilion, a project I had personally engineered around a flood-prone site nobody else thought was buildable, Derek accepted the award alone. He mentioned me in his speech. One sentence. And of course my incredible wife, who supports me every step of the way. Supports. Not designed. Not solved the impossible drainage problem that took me 4 months and 2 structural revisions. Supports. When our daughter Nora wrote her 6th grade essay on someone who inspires me, she wrote about her father, the man who built beautiful buildings. I didn't correct her. I didn't want my daughter to learn that credit is something you have to fight your own family for. At company events, over the years, I got used to being introduced as Derek's wife. Not Vivian, not the engineer, not the majority owner of the trust that made the whole operation solvent whenever a project ran over budget. Just Derek's wife, standing near the bar in a dress someone complimented before asking if I worked too, in that tone people use when they've already decided the answer doesn't matter. I want to be honest about something. Derek was not, for most of those years, a cruel man. He was worse, in a way. He was a convincing one. Every time I felt the shape of the unfairness, he had a reasonable explanation ready, delivered warmly, like a man solving a problem instead of creating one. It's optics, V. It's just easier this way. You've never wanted the spotlight. I'm protecting that. He had turned my own preference for privacy into the very leash that kept me quiet. The retirement of our lead architect, Carl, is when I first felt something shift in me. Not anger yet, more like a cold clarity. Carl had worked with my father. At his farewell dinner, he pulled me aside and said, quietly, almost apologetically, "Your dad would be proud of what you built here, V. I just wish more people knew it was you." I smiled and thanked him, and went home and cried in the shower, where no one could hear it over the water. That was 18 months before the gala. I didn't act on it. I just filed it away, the way I'd filed away every small erasure before it, telling myself that someday, when it mattered enough, I would do something. Someday turned out to be a Saturday night in April, under string lights strung across the harborfront event space we'd designed together 15 years earlier. The 20th anniversary gala was Derek's idea, technically, but I did the planning that mattered. I'm the one who tracked down my father's original blueprint for that very building, the Harbor Pavilion, from a storage unit in North Charleston, had it cleaned and restored by a conservator in Savannah, and had it framed in reclaimed cypress to match the building's original beams. I planned to give it to Derek in front of the room, a quiet tribute to the man whose name was on the door. I thought it would mean something to him. I thought, foolishly, it might remind him where all of this had actually come from. I arrived a little late, the framed blueprint wrapped in brown paper under my arm, because I'd stopped to pick up the Kyoto tickets from the printer, the surprise second half of the night. Derek and I had talked for years about going. 20th anniversary of the company felt, to me, like the right excuse to finally do it. I had booked a ryokan with a view of the Kamo River. I had planned the whole thing without telling him, the way you plan something you're excited to watch someone's face do. I heard the applause before I reached the ballroom doors. 300 people stood under the string lights, drinks in hand, all facing a small stage where our company's new website was projected onto a screen. Except it wasn't our website, not the one I knew. The banner across the top read Sinclair Group, in a bold new typeface, with our old logo, the one my father had sketched by hand, nowhere in sight. For a moment I thought I'd walked into the wrong event. Derek stood on the small stage in a tuxedo, microphone in hand, that wide, practiced smile on his face, the one that had once made me believe in things before they existed. Beside him stood Priya Anand, our newly promoted president and COO, in a deep green gown, smiling the way people smile when they think they're at the center of something wonderful. 20 years ago, Derek was saying, this company started with one belief, that buildings should have soul. Tonight, we're not just celebrating 20 years, we're stepping into the next 20, which is why, starting Monday, this firm will operate under a new name, Sinclair Group, a name that reflects where we're going, not just where we've been. The room applauded. I stood frozen near the back doors, with a framed blueprint of my father's handwriting wrapped in brown paper under my arm, and no one in that entire ballroom turned to look for me. Then Derek turned to Priya, and the room's attention shifted with him, and I understood, in the half-second before it happened, exactly what was coming. Priya has been more than a partner in this business, he said, his voice catching in that rehearsed, camera-ready way. She's been the partner I didn't know I needed. He dropped to one knee. A woman near me gasped audibly. Priya's hands flew to her mouth. Derek opened a small velvet box, and even from 30 feet away, under string lights, I could see the ring catch the light exactly the way the harbor water caught it behind them. The crowd erupted. Someone near the bar shouted, "Yes!" before Priya even had the chance to answer. She said it anyway, tears streaming, nodding, and Derek stood and kissed her. Not a nervous, embarrassed kiss, but a full, certain one, the kind of kiss a person gives when they've stopped being afraid of being seen. I felt the framed blueprint grow heavy in my arms. His eyes found mine across the ballroom exactly once, in the half-second after the kiss ended, and something in his face went very still. He knew. He knew I was standing there. And still, he didn't move toward me. He didn't say my name into that microphone. He turned back to Priya and let the room keep clapping. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, he renamed my father's company before he told me he was engaged to someone else. Of the two betrayals happening in that room, I genuinely couldn't tell you, in that moment, which one hollowed me out faster. Priya's eyes drifted past Derek and landed on me. I watched confusion cross her face, the look of someone trying to place a stranger at a party. She mouthed something. I read her lips clearly across the room. "I'm sorry. Do we know each other?" That was the sentence that finally moved my feet. Not the ring, not the kiss, not even the new name glowing on the screen behind them. It was watching a woman I'd never wronged look at me with polite, apologetic confusion. Because my own husband hadn't thought I was worth mentioning, even as a warning. I set the framed blueprint down gently on a cocktail table near the door, because some part of me still couldn't bring myself to let it fall. Then I turned around and walked out through the same doors I'd come in through less than 4 minutes earlier. No one stopped me. A server offered me a tray of champagne on my way out, and I actually took a glass, out of some absurd muscle memory of politeness, and set it down untouched on the hostess stand before I stepped into the parking garage. I sat in my car for a full minute before my hands started shaking. The Kyoto tickets were still in my bag. I looked at the printed itinerary, 2 names, 1 ryokan, 1 riverview, and something in my chest went from breaking to bricklaying in the space of that single minute. I did not storm back into that ballroom. I did not call Derek screaming. Instead, I opened my phone, and I began, calmly, methodically, to take back everything that had only ever been mine to begin with. First, I canceled the Kyoto trip. It took 90 seconds and a small cancellation fee I didn't care about. Then I called our bank's private client line and froze every joint account requiring mutual authorization, a clause Derek himself had insisted on years ago, back when he still worried about protecting the family's assets from outside risk. He'd meant other people. I used it on him. Then I called Walter Ibsen. Walt had been my father's attorney before he became mine, and he'd drafted most of the trust documents that governed the company's ownership. He answered on the second ring, his voice immediately sharpening when he heard mine. "V, what happened?" "Derek renamed the company tonight," I said, "in front of 300 people. Then he got engaged to Priya Anand on a stage under our logo. Except it wasn't our logo anymore, Walt. He'd already replaced it." There was a silence on the line long enough that I could hear him breathing. "I'm heading to the office," he said. "No," I said. "Start with the trademark and IP holdings first. The Reyes Callaway name, the original logo, the Harbor Pavilion design rights, all of it sits with the family trust, correct?" "It does." "Then issue an immediate cease and desist on the rebrand. He doesn't have authority to retire a trademark the trust owns without board and trust approval. And Walt, freeze my voting shares proxy. I want to personally review every authorization that's gone out under my name in the last 5 years." Walt didn't ask if I was sure. He'd known me since I was 19 years old, arguing with my father about seismic load calculations at the dinner table. He knew the difference between an emotional decision and a decision that had been waiting patiently for its moment. "I'm on it tonight," he said. By the time I pulled into our driveway, 40 minutes later, my phone had already logged 63 missed calls. By the time I stepped inside, that number had climbed to over 100. I didn't turn on the lights right away. I stood in our front hallway in the dark, still in my gala dress, my heels in one hand, listening to the house's familiar silence. Biscuit, our old rescue greyhound, padded over and pressed his head against my leg, the way he always did when he sensed something in the house had shifted. I sat down on the bottom stair and put my hand on his back and let myself breathe for the first time since I'd seen that ring catch the light. The doorbell rang 40 minutes later. I didn't move. "V," Derek's voice, muffled through the door, cracking in a way I hadn't heard in years. "I know you're in there. Please, just talk to me." I looked down at my phone glowing in the dark hallway. Another call from him lit up the screen. A photo I'd never bothered to change. Derek in a paint-splattered t-shirt on the porch of our first rental house, before the tailored suits, before the magazine covers, before ambition hardened into something that had learned to erase people quietly and call it optics. I let it ring out. He knocked again, longer this time, and I finally stood and walked to the door, though I only opened it halfway. The chain still latched. He stood on our porch in his tuxedo jacket, tie loosened, hair no longer perfectly arranged, sweat visible along his hairline despite the cool April night. "Derek," I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. "What exactly did you think was going to happen tonight? V, please, let me explain." "Explain what?" I said. "The part where you renamed my father's company without telling me? Or the part where you proposed to someone else in front of everyone we've ever worked with?" His mouth opened, then closed. Behind him, in the driveway, I could see his car door still hanging open, as if he'd abandoned it mid-motion. "It got complicated," he finally said. I almost laughed. That had always been his gift, turning every choice he'd made into weather, into something that had simply rolled in, rather than something he'd built one decision at a time. When did it get complicated? I asked. Before the rebrand or before the ring? He flinched. Behind him, his phone buzzed in his jacket pocket. He glanced down at it and turned the screen away from me, but not before I caught the name. Walter Ibsen, my attorney. Calling him. "What did you do?" he asked, his voice suddenly sharp with something closer to fear than anger. "I protected what's mine," I said. "The same thing you should have done 20 years ago, instead of putting your name on things I built. V, you can't just pull the trademark rights like that." "There are procedures. There are contracts," I corrected. "The ones you helped write. I'm simply the first person in this marriage to actually read them tonight." He stared at me the way you stare at a language you used to speak fluently and have somehow forgotten. I thought of the 12 years since my father died, the 71% sitting quietly in a trust bearing his name, the small, cumulative unfairness of 100 introductions where I was somebody's wife instead of somebody's engineer. "Does Priya know?" I asked. "That you told everyone the company was solely yours to rename?" His silence answered before he could stop it. "Does she know," I continued, "that 71% of what you just renamed after yourself belongs to a trust that isn't in your name at all?" "V. Go explain it to her," I said. "I imagine she's got questions of her own by now. Are you divorcing me?" He asked, and for the first time all night, his voice actually broke. The word landed strangely, not dramatic, the way I might once have expected, but administrative, like naming a document that had already been quietly drafted, page by page, over 20 years of small erasures I'd chosen not to count until tonight, forced the total. "Yes," I said. His face crumpled for exactly 1 second, before something colder replaced it, the particular look of a man doing math on what he stood to lose. "And the company," he said. I looked at him through the narrow gap the chain allowed. "The company," I said, "was never yours to rename." I closed the door. I heard him stand there for a long moment, and then I heard his footsteps retreat, slow and uneven, toward his car. The emergency board meeting convened at 9 the next morning, called not by Derek but by 2 directors who'd spent the night fielding panicked calls from vendors asking why the company website had gone dark. Walt had moved fast. The trademark and IP holdings reverted to trust control within hours, which meant, practically speaking, that Sinclair Group no longer had a website, a logo, or a legal right to either, less than 12 hours after its unveiling. I sat at my kitchen table in a gray sweater, biscuit curled at my feet, Walt's face steady on my laptop screen beside me. One by one the directors joined the call, each looking like they'd aged a year overnight. Derek joined last, from what I recognized as his office, no longer the executive suite with the harbor view, but a smaller conference room down the hall, which told me security had already moved him. The board chair, a measured woman named Colette Ferris who'd sat on our board since my father's tenure, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "We've received formal notice," she said, "that the Reyes-Callaway Family Trust has reasserted full control over the company's name, trademark, and core design portfolio, effective immediately. Mrs. Sinclair, can you confirm this is accurate?" "I can," I said, "and the trust remains the beneficial owner of 71% of the company." "It does." Derek leaned toward his camera. "V, this is an emotional decision, and I understand why, but you can't unilaterally." "I made no unilateral decisions," I said, calm, the way Walt had coached me. "I exercised rights that have existed since before this company had your name on it." Colette turned to him. "Derek, is there anything about last night's announcement the board should have been informed of in advance?" A long pause. "The rebrand was meant to modernize our market position," he said carefully. "Was it approved by the trust, as your own governing documents require for any change to the company's core identity?" Silence. "No," he finally admitted. The room, or rather, the small grid of faces on my laptop, went very quiet. That silence was the sound of 30 years of assumption finally meeting 30 seconds of documentation. It was Renata Cole, the forensic accountant Walt brought in that same afternoon, who found the second problem, the one that turned this from an ugly personal rupture into something with actual legal weight. She and her team spent 3 days inside a locked conference room at the office, working through 5 years of authorization records, vendor contracts, equity transfer forms, expense approvals bearing my signature. My signature, except it wasn't. Not quite. Close enough to pass a glance, wrong enough to fail forensic analysis. Someone had been signing my name to documents I had never seen, for years, mostly small things at first, travel reimbursements, minor contract approvals, the kind of forgeries built to stay beneath notice rather than announce themselves. How many? I asked Walt, when he called with the pattern confirmed. We're still counting, he said. Dozens at minimum. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up. Derek hadn't just erased me from a logo, he'd been quietly forging my consent for years, on the theory, I can only assume, that I would never look closely enough to notice, because I'd spent 2 decades training myself not to. The board placed him on administrative leave that Thursday, pending investigation. By the following week, with Renata's findings in hand, they voted to terminate him for cause and refer the forged authorizations to outside counsel. Priya called me on a Tuesday afternoon, 4 days after the gala. I almost let it go to voicemail. I answered instead. I don't think I have any right to call you, she said, her voice smaller than I remembered it from the stage. But I needed to say I didn't know, about the trust, about any of it. He told me you two had been separated for almost 2 years. I know, I said. I believe you. She exhaled, sharp and unsteady, like she'd been holding that breath since Saturday. He showed me a lease, an apartment downtown. He said it was proof he'd already moved out. I closed my eyes. Another lie built with paperwork sturdy enough to survive a glance. There was no apartment before this week, I said. If he showed you a lease, it's recent. She made a small, wounded sound. I feel sick. You should feel misled, I said. Not guilty. Those aren't the same thing. The board's independent review eventually cleared Priya of any involvement in the forged documents or the trademark decision. She'd approved the rebrand, believing, like everyone else in that ballroom, that Derek held the authority he claimed. She was reinstated as COO 6 weeks later and asked, before accepting, whether I thought she should. I told her the truth. She'd earned the role. What she did next with it was up to her. The hardest conversation, in the end, wasn't with Derek or Priya. It was with our daughter. Nora is 17, sharp enough to see through most things adults try to soften for her, and she'd grown up believing, at least in part, that her father was the singular creative force behind everything our family had built. I sat with her at our kitchen table 2 days after the gala and told her the truth, plainly, without asking her to take sides, that the company had always belonged, on paper and in practice, to my side of the family, and that her father had spent years letting the world believe otherwise. She was quiet for a long time. Then she asked, "Did you know that people thought it was all him?" "I knew," I said. "Why didn't you say something?" It was, I think, the fairest question anyone asked me that whole year, and I didn't have a clean answer, because I told myself it didn't matter, as long as I knew the truth, I said. I was wrong. It mattered to you. It should have mattered to me sooner, too. She didn't say it was okay, because it wasn't, entirely. But she hugged me, and a few weeks later she asked if she could shadow Renata's team over the summer. So I actually understand how the company works, instead of just whose name is on it. I think that was Nora's version of choosing a side, and it wasn't her father's. Derek came back to the house 3 nights after the board meeting. Not pounding this time. 1 knock, then he waited. I opened the door but left the chain on. "I deserve that," he said, looking at the chain. "Yes," I said. "I lost the company." "No," I said. "You lost the illusion that it was yours to rename." His eyes filled, but I didn't soften. Not because I wanted him to hurt, but because I'd spent 20 years softening every hard truth until he learned he could simply step around it. "Are you sorry because you hurt me?" I asked. "Or because it's finally costing you something?" He looked down at the porch boards for a long time. "I don't know anymore," he finally said. It was, I think, the first fully honest thing he'd said to me since Valentine cards and drafting tables and a rented storefront on King Street. The civil settlement over the forged documents took most of that year to resolve. Restitution, permanent restrictions on Derek serving as an officer of any company under the trust's related agreements. A quiet, thorough unwinding of 20 years of borrowed credit. It wasn't dramatic. There was no single satisfying moment where everything balanced out at once. Justice, I learned, rarely arrives that way. It arrives in numbered pages, in signatures compared side by side under fluorescent light, in a board vote that takes 4 minutes and ends 2 decades. The board asked if I wanted to take over as CEO. Years earlier, I might have said yes without hesitation, just to prove I could. Instead, I said no, and chose the role of executive chair instead, steering the long-term vision, restoring my father's name to the letterhead where it belonged, and leaving daily operations to Priya, who ran the place, I'll admit, with more transparency than Derek ever had. That September, I finally took the Kyoto trip. Same city, different itinerary, 1 ticket instead of 2. I walked without a schedule. I sat by the Kamo River with tea that went cold because I was too busy watching the water to drink it. On my last evening, I crossed a bridge Derek and I had once talked about visiting together, years before either of us knew what we'd become to each other, and I made myself one promise instead of the ones I used to make about us. Never again confuse being useful to someone with being valued by them. They are not the same thing, and I had spent 20 years paying the difference without noticing the bill. A few months later, Derek sent me a letter. An actual letter, not a text. He'd taken a project management position at a small firm upstate. Nothing with his name on the door. No press, no keynote stages. He wrote that he unlocked the office himself most mornings and locked up most nights, and that for the first time in years he understood exactly what his title meant, because it was the only thing about the job that wasn't performance. He apologized, not for losing the company, but for spending 20 years believing that being seen mattered more than being honest with the people who'd trusted him. I don't know if I'll ever fully forgive him. I know I've stopped carrying it as a debt I owe him an answer to. People sometimes ask if any of this brought me peace. Freezing the accounts, reclaiming the name, watching it all come apart in boardrooms instead of screaming matches. Honestly, no. It brought me justice. Peace came later, quieter, on a bridge in Kyoto with nobody's name on the ticket but mine. I didn't win because Derek lost everything. I won the moment I stopped measuring my own worth by whether he, or anyone else in that ballroom, bothered to notice it. Sometimes the loudest kind of strength isn't the confrontation everyone's waiting for. It's turning around, walking out quietly, and simply refusing to let someone else's choices decide who you become next. If this story hit home for you, I'd love to know, what would you have done standing in that ballroom? Would you have made a scene or walked away the way Vivian did? Tell me in the comments. And if stories about quiet strength, betrayal, and second chances are your thing, stick around. There's another one coming soon.